Like any other country, the Netherlands has a rich history. It was part of many empires, such as the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburg, the Spanish Habsburg, the French Empire. You know, the Netherlands was home to small mini-states, to duchies, to earldoms. But yeah, like I said, we were also occupied many times. At the same time, we also did some occupying ourselves. Colonize some places, yeah, wasn't exactly great. So we stole a lot of things. Some items are now being returned to the rightful owners, as we should. All of the countries that occupied the Netherlands also stole things from us. And one of the things that they stole is the very first Mosasaurus skull. And who stole it? Well, the French. France stole it when they occupied the Netherlands in 1794, and they've had the skull ever since. And we've wanted it back the entire time, but they have not given it back just yet. So here's the full story, and perhaps, I don't know, perhaps something's happening with this video that will finally get it back, a big diplomatic scandal. It's 1778. Workmen are doing the daily task in the chalk quarries near one of the oldest cities in the Netherlands, Maastricht. The workers found a fossil in the St. Petersberg, told Canon Godding, who was the owner of the land and therefore also the owner of the school. And they also told Mr. Hofmann, who was a surgeon and also very known for his interest and knowledge in these kind of ancient fossils. Eventually the fossil was dug out of the chalk, and Hofmann did some research and Godding was the owner. Pretty soon, obviously, the Netherlands was ecstatic. No one had ever seen anything like this, so no one knew what it was. Was it like a feisty crocodile, a toothed whale, or something completely different? So Hofmann corresponded with Dutch professor Petrus Kamper about Sol, and where Hofmann thought it was a giant crocodile, Kamper thought it was a big toothed whale. Both were wrong. In 1798, the son of Petrus Kamper, Adriaan Gillis Kamper, he went over the description of his father, and he thought of something else. He actually thought it was a giant monitor lizard, and he communicated his thoughts with the Frenchman Georges Cuvier in 1799, and after George obtained the fossil, he actually agreed with Adriaan in 1808. Now, Adriaan Kamper then published a larger description of more remains from Mosasaurus fossils from Maastricht, and then in 1822, William Daniel Conybeare gave the fossil the name Mosasaurus. Mosa is the Latin word for the Maas, and the Maas is the river that runs through the entire province of Limburg from the south, where Maastricht is located, all the way to the north. And then Gideon Montel added hoffmanni in 1829. So what is the Mosasaurus? The Mosasaurus is an extinct marine reptile that lived at the end of the dinosaur era. It's not a dinosaur because it's a marine animal. The Mosasaurus is closely related to lizards and to snakes and lived around 68 million years ago. They could reach up to 70 meters in length and lived in the shallow sea, which was located around present-day Maastricht. Now, a thick layer of lime was found at the bottom that preserved the fossil. Now, the reason why the Mosasaurus fossil is so important to the Netherlands and to Maastricht especially is because one, it's the first one that was ever found, so obviously it's important. Two, it also played an important role in thinking about extinction via natural circumstances and the origin of species. So it opened the door to, for instance, Darwin's theory of evolution. There was no other animal on planet Earth that could be traced back to the Mosasaurus, which meant that there used to be animal species that nowadays, no longer exist. And obviously now we know this, but at that time that wasn't a common thought. So why don't we have the Mosasaurus fossil in the Netherlands? The fossil was found in 1778 by quarrymen, like I said. And now it's early spring in the year 1793. The French tried to conquer Maastricht during the siege of Maastricht led by de Miranda, in the hopes to make the city part of the First French Republic. Luckily for us, they failed. It took place during the First Coalition War between France and other European powers and ended with a French defeat. Unfortunately for us, and for other countries, the French tried again, and in September 1794 there was another siege of Maastricht, which ended up in a win for the French and the annexation of Maastricht. And by now the Mosasaurus had been international, like big news. And one of the first things that soldiers were ordered to do is to find the famous fossil and bring it home. You might think, home? Isn't it already home? Well, yeah, that's what we thought. It was home, didn't stay there. So our Mosasaurus fossil was quickly seized by Napoleon's occupation army and shipped to France. Maastricht and the rest of the Netherlands, obviously, we want it back. The fossil is a link to the era when this region's sand and limestone soil was still the ocean floor. We have a replica of the first Mosasaurus in a Natuurhistorisch Museum in Maastricht, which France deems is good enough. But the real one is in the National History Museum in Paris since 1795, where it's one of the millions of pieces that they have and it's not even in a prominent location. Whereas, in Maastricht, it would be the main thing. So the French called our fossil their national historic heritage. Some years ago, it was shipped to Maastricht temporarily for an exhibition, which was already terrible difficult to get. I also find that calling stolen items, your national historic heritage, when they don't belong to you, fascinating. Now, the French stories of obtaining the Mosasaurus fossil go the following. The workers found the fossil embedded in the St. Petersberg and took it home to the landowner Theodorus Godding, who was the canon at the local church. The canon apparently did not appreciate the fossil's value, so it is said that he offered it as a donation to the French geologist Barthélemy Faujas de Saint-Fond and his superior Augustin Lucie de Fréchin for around 600 bottles of wine after Maastricht was occupied. Another story is that the workers asked the help of a man named Hofmann, who was besides a doctor also very fascinated and interested, in these types of things. Then Canon Godding claimed the fossils as they were found on his soil and created a court case. After the court case and the annexation of Maastricht, Godding gave the fossil to the French, blah blah blah. There were some other stories about the French and the fossil, but all of them basically say that people gave it away to the French. Now, a former Dutch student called Peggy Rompe, who dedicated her winning thesis to the kidnapping of the fossil, has investigated everything and came to the conclusion that it, surprise, surprise, is all a lie. There was never a court case, there was no conflict between either Godding or Hofmann, and according to her research, Godding was the original owner of the skull and Hofmann never even possessed it. The story was simply meant to conceal the fact that the French stole the fossil in conflict with their own political ideas, as they stole it from the citizens that found it and those that researched it. In this way, they could justify the stolen fossil. Also, I told you about the French geologist who was in Maastricht when it was occupied. And you might wonder, what is a geologist like the Saint-Fond doing in freshly occupied Maastricht? Peggy Rompe also examined archives following the 2 decades of French occupation of Maastricht. And what she found was rather interesting. She found a 1794 decree from Paris ordering the famous skull to be seized and taken to France. She also found copies of letters from the canon niece to the French government, where she repeatedly asked for the skull, so vulgarly stolen, to be returned. She never got an answer. Now, the French government tried to fabricate the stories in order to justify their seizure of the fossil and to bring it back to France as soon as they could. In fact, that's not something they are unfamiliar with, because France has been responsible for a lot of organized looting on both art and cultural objects. Napoleon's armies were accompanied by art historians and visited occupied territories and seized art objects on a massive scale. You might wonder, how did they do that? They did it by using treaty agreements, and most of the looted objects, including our Mosasaurus, were immediately deemed national property. Now, Napoleon then justified his deeds, obviously, by saying that he was creating a universal museum not just for the French, but for an international public. Unsurprisingly, the so-called Universal Museum, not just for the French, is in fact located in the capital city of France, home to, you might have guessed it, the French. What's also not surprising is that the Dutch government asked for it to be returned again at the end of the 1990s and so on. The director of the National History Museum in Paris, of the paleontology department at the time, said something that would make only Napoleon proud. He said in the 1990s, when it was lost, officially asked back by the Dutch government, he said the fossils belong to humanity and are not rightfully Dutch or French. Then, just my thoughts. If they belong to humanity, humanity can surely see the fossil in Maastricht, the place where it was actually found. He says that he also said that we should be content with what we have, which is a copy or cast of the first Mosasaurus. You would think that if you're a director of a paleontology department, then you would understand that a copy is not sufficient. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, all claims for repatriation were settled at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, but we're not going to pretend that all went as honest as it could be, because the great 5 powers that were negotiating were Austria, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and France. And France had an advantageous position. Also, besides the big 5, smaller powers were only given very few opportunities to advocate for their own interests and only joined meetings every now and then. For the Netherlands, the representatives were the Earl of Clancarty, who was the British ambassador at the Dutch court, and Baron Hans von Gagen, who was a German statesman and political writer, and he did succeed in obtaining quite a considerable augmentation of territory, but artworks and, historical pieces were a different piece of cake. During the Congress of Vienna, some artworks were repatriated, others were suddenly untraceable, and others were assigned to France, such as the Mosasaurus. But let's be honest here, it's not unlikely that with France being one of the big, one of the five great powers, and the other smaller countries having barely a chance to advocate their interest, that it's surprising that our fossil was assigned to France. And it's not because the French deserved it, it's because they were deemed a bigger and more important power. We've tried getting it back many times, 1814, 1827, 1990s, and so on. During the second half of the 20th century, the debate surrounding the repatriation of objects became tense, and by the 1990s, the Dutch government was trying to get the Mosasaurus back again, like I said, we've tried before, on basically a permanent loan. Kind of strange because it's ours. France deems our fossil their national heritage, but one, it was found on Dutch soil, two, it was found by Dutch workers, three, it was named after the Maas River, four, it was stolen by the French. That doesn't really sound French, now does it? In 2009, the Mosasaurus came temporarily for an exhibition to the Naturelle Museum in Maastricht, but that's as far as we've gone to having the real thing in our hands. And yes, we have some other remains of some Mosasaurus fossils nowadays, but it's not the first Mosasaurus fossil that was ever found, and we deserve to have it because it's important Dutch history, not French. Some people say that after a century or so, these stolen artifacts and important historical and cultural pieces should now be part of the country that stole them, as it's now part of their history. But I find it such a lame excuse. Just because you stole it doesn't mean it's yours. I find the same thing for colonial items that were stolen by the Dutch. If the country we stole it from wants it back, we should send it back. And if it wasn't for the locals that made a discovery of this big sea lizard of the country that the French invaded, the French wouldn't have never gotten it in the first place. So, what do you think? Should they give it back? I think they should. But, given it's the French, I doubt it will happen.